Stanford University.
Thank you very, very much. I should say that, by way of introduction, that speaking before an audience as learned as I take the one assembled in this room, I'm reminded of my first tutorial at Cambridge University in the autumn of 1956. I don't now remember the name of the Don assigned by Magdalen College to set my New World feet on the path of the Old World wisdom. But I remember the setting: late afternoon fog, coals burning in an ancient grate. The Don in academic gown seated behind a silver tea service, preliminary remarks in favor of Shakespeare and Admiral Lord Nelson. 5 months earlier, I'd been graduated from Yale University with honors on my final examinations in the intention of becoming an historian. My professors in New Haven had welcomed the prospect, leading me to believe that I had a firm grasp of what was then a trend-setting course of study admitted to the curriculum under the rubric of intellectual history. Mention the name of a sublime poet or an unhorsed king, and I could be counted upon to attach the wiring to the appropriate zeitgeist, produce concepts not unlike the ones that prompted the 16th century Cambridge wits, among them Christopher Marlowe, to think that from Lord Strange they could learn the trick of changing lead into gold. My tutor was delighted to learn that wonders never ceased. Yes, well, he said, I see, great news, of course, but maybe you could spare a few moments for the 12th century. I managed to sustain the illusion of scholarship for about the length of time it takes to see 5 deals of blackjack, juggling the equivalents of spoons and rubber balls, drawing parallels between the Ptolemaic universe and the semicircular arrangement of Amsterdam's canals, sending Eleanor of Aquitaine on the Second Crusade in company with a Red Cross knight and a manual of courtly love, finding in the murdered St. Thomas à Becket the sculptor's model for a gargoyle facing west from the facade of Chartres Cathedral. When I'd exhausted my supply of PowerPoints, the tutor poured us both a second cup of tea, and for the next quarter of an hour, with an air of utmost courtesy, offering plum cake or perhaps a glass of sherry, he asked questions about aspects of the 12th century that possibly I had overlooked. The coins in circulation on the upper and lower Rhine, times of travel by land from Rouen to Bordeaux, by sea from Marseille to Dover, what was afoot with the heavenly host in Rome, as between the two cities of Cairo and Baghdad, which boasted the larger concentrations of wealth and religious superstition. In Byzantium, the prices bid and asked for Russian fur and Christian slaves. My failure to hazard even so much as a plausible guess moved the Don to a gentle murmur of mild regret, as if he'd been hoping to see at least one of the rubber balls defy the laws of gravity. Yes, well, he said, you Americans have this wonderful talent for broad statement and grand abstraction that hasn't been granted to their less fortunate relatives here in England. Before reaching the general theory, you see, we like to have in hand a passing acquaintance with at least some of the facts. Dismal habit, of course, he said, and very tiresome, but one that we can't seem to escape. My year in Cambridge put an end to my thought of becoming a licensed historian, but it deepened my respect for the reading of history and the study of the humanities. I learned that by not rating myself a scholar, I was free to make mistakes. And because I looked for an understanding of human character, I didn't much care whether the setup was Paris in the 1680s or Philadelphia in the 1770s. From an author in whose book I could hear the sound of a human voice, I was willing to listen to anything and everything, to reports of marvels in Samarkand or Sutter's Mill, to accounts of Talleyrand's mistresses and Kaiser Wilhelm's uniforms, to the music criticism of Rameau's nephew and the geopolitical theory of Genghis Khan. And I use that as a sort of an opening, tell you where I'm coming from. And I had the same kind of experience in 1984 when I redesigned Harper's magazine. And I took it upon myself to write a notebook column, which was at the beginning of the magazine, which was intended to acquaint the magazine's reader with the presumptions of its editors. But to meet the requirement, I undertook to learn to write an essay, a form of literary address at which I hadn't had much practice, but in which, fortunately, I had encountered most of the authors in whose company I had learned to read. Also, fortunately, my understanding of what constituted an essay was sufficiently non-restrictive to account for the letters of Seneca, as well as Twain's sketches and Thurber's fables, Flaubert's dictionary, Poor Richard's almanac, Gibbon's notes on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and together with the miscellaneous observations of Plutarch, Swift, Strachey, Guadella, Chesterton, and Bolitho. A long list that became even longer when I added the names of the living authors that I published in Harper's Magazine over the course of the administrations of 5 American presidents. And some of those people were Evan Cannell, Joan Didion, Eduardo Galeano, Barry Lopez, John Leonard, Edward Hoagland, Annie Dillard, Walter Karp, and so forth. I was very lucky over my years as the editor to deal with some very, very good writers indeed. And I mention only a few of the names, but they're representative because they suggest the range of expression and the wealth of possibility that I rope into a notion of the essay borrowed from Montaigne. Montaigne was a contemporary of Shakespeare and Cervantes, and he derived the approach to his topics from the meaning of the word essay, to try, to attempt, to embark upon, asking himself at the outset of his reflections, whether on cannibals or the custom of wearing clothes, what do I know? And to me, that is the question that distinguishes the essay from the less adventurous forms of expository prose. It's what distinguishes it, say, from the dissertation or the polemic, the article, the campaign speech, the arrest warrant, or the hotel bill. Writers determined to render a judgment or swing an election, to cast a moneylender out of a temple or deliver a message to Garcia, begin the first paragraph knowing how, when, where, and why they intend to claim the privilege of the last word. Not so the essayist, even if what he or she is writing purports to be a history or a field report. Like Twain's Huckleberry Finn, the essayist lights out for the territories, never sure of the next sentence until the words show up on the page. Thus, an improvisation, experimental and provisional, amenable to multiple shifts of perspective, quickly changed with only a slight tinkering of emphasis or circumstance into a sales pitch or a sermon, which probably is why Benjamin Franklin, one of the truly marvelous American essayists, treated the essay as a literary device best suited to the restlessness of the American spirit, which was in a hurry to settle a new line of country, find a fortune, assemble a body politic, compose the portrait of a convincing self. Daniel Boorstin, the historian and once upon a time librarian of Congress, touched on the same point when describing the makeshift character of the colonial experience. This is Boorstin. No prudent man dared to be too certain of exactly who he was or what he was about. Everyone had to be prepared to become someone else. To be ready for such perilous transmigrations was to become an American. Carry the observation around the next bend in the river or up into the next stand of cottonwood trees, and the essayist, like it or not, willingly or no, becomes, as per the advisory once issued by another librarian of Congress, the poet Archibald MacLeish, The dissenter, this is McLeish, is every human being at those moments of his life when he resigns momentarily from the herd and thinks for himself, which is easier said than done. And I was never very good at it. And an opinion I always found hard to come by. The monthly notebook column called for remarks somehow related to something visible in the news. Scandal in Washington, war in Israel, money in Hollywood, sex in Connecticut. But on none of the topics was I equipped with either certain knowledge or inside information. What I was apt to know about President Clinton or Michael Jackson was of a piece with what I was apt to know about Princess Diana or President Bush. That is to say, nothing much beyond what I'd seen on television or read in the newspapers. And as I remembered from my own days working as a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune and as a writer for the Saturday Evening Post, what was in the newspapers was often even less than nothing much. How then to proceed? And so I borrow the device, the authority of Montaigne, who begins his essay Of Books with what would be regarded on both Wall Street and Capitol Hill as a career-ending display of transparency. This is Montaigne. I have no doubt that I often speak of things which are better treated by the masters of the craft, and with more truth. This is simply a trial of my natural faculties and not of my acquired ones. If anyone catches me in ignorance, he will score no triumph over me, since I can hardly be answerable to another for my reasonings when I am not answerable for them to myself, and am never satisfied with them. These are my fancies, in which I make no attempt to convey information about things, only about myself. I may have some objective knowledge one day, or may perhaps have had it in the past when I happened to light on passages that explain things, but I have forgotten it all, for though I am a man of some reading, I am one who retains nothing. And this is my own case. When I was 30, I assumed that by the time I was 50, I would know what I was talking about. The notice didn't arrive in the mail. At 50, I knew less than what I thought I knew at 30. And so I figured that by the time I was 70, then surely, this being America, where all the stories supposedly end in the key of C major, I would have come up with a reason to believe that I had been made wise. But now I am 76, and I see no sign of a dog with a bird in its mouth. I'm reminded instead of a story told about Pablo Casals at the age of 93, living in Puerto Rico with a woman many years younger than himself. A journalist sent forth from New York asked him why he practiced the cello every morning for 4 hours. Here he was, the most famous cellist in the world, no longer performing on the concert stage, at ease in the Caribbean sun. Why then the unnecessary labor? Because, so Casals is reported to have said, because I'm learning something. And I approach the act and art of writing with the same hope. I never know what I think about anything, whether it's the stains on Monica Lewinsky's dress or O.J. Simpson's golf swing, until I try to set up a thought in a sentence or catch it in the butterfly net of a metaphor. Construe the essay as a thinking out loud, and by its improvisational nature, it inclines in the direction of poetry or music, the language meant to be heard, not seen. On the opening of a book or looking into a manuscript, I listen for the sound of a voice in the first person singular. And from authors whom I read more than once, I learn to value the weight of words and to delight in their meter and cadence. In Gibbon's polyphonic counterpoint and Guadella's command of the subjunctive, in Mailer's hyperbole and Dillard's similes. And that was the way I judged manuscripts coming into Harper's magazine from writers I didn't know. I mean, I'd start reading it, and if by if I could hear the sound of the voice of the writer who was trying to get at the truth of something that he or she had seen or thought or felt, I'd continue and hope to get it into the magazine. And if I couldn't hear that, if I was hearing instead some kind of jargon or politically correct prose or something that had been desanitized in one way or another and didn't have the feeling of an individual voice, I'd let it go. And the work, I never found it got easier trying to write the essay. I'd write a lot of drafts, and sometimes by the time I got through the third draft, I'd see that I was going in a completely wrong, down a blind alley, and I'd have to start over. But I welcomed the drafts. I enjoyed it because it got to be more fun as I got further into it. Because I could then experiment and I could try to fool around with satire or fool around with subordinate clauses and try to replace always the adjective with a noun. When I was first a newspaper reporter, I came from Cambridge and I came back to start as a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, 1957. And I was sent to the bureau in the Oakland City Hall, which was an old-fashioned front page kind of press room. Guys lying around on couches listening to the police radio with hats over their faces. And I was assigned to cover a flower show in Berkeley. And it was for the Sunday paper, and I let it all, I wrote 4,000 words on the flower show that had all kinds of, literary overtones, complicated phrases, and I brought it to the senior correspondent in Oakland. It was a man named Crowley, and Crowley read it, and he looked at me, and he said, "This is the most beautiful piece of writing I've ever read." I almost wept. But he said, "Do me a favor, cut it in half." And so with great agony, I did. Losing each phrase was it was like taking blood from me. And I brought it back to Crowley, and Crowley read it, and he said, "It's even more beautiful, but cut it in half again." It finally ended up in the paper as one paragraph. and I don't think it had a single adjective. So when I start writing an essay, my object is to learn and not preach. And that is one of the reasons that I've never been formally inducted into the National College of Pundits. But it has encouraged my reading of history. And again, I borrow the method of Montaigne, who measured the worth of his own observations against those that he came across in the archive of classical antiquity, most reliably in the writings of Plutarch and Seneca. I soon discovered that I had as much to learn from the counsel of the dead as I did from the advice and consent of the living. The reading of history damps down the impulse to slender the trend and tenor of one's own times. And it stills a sense of humor, and it is a defense against the arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. So that on listening to Obama preach the doctrine of freedom-loving military invasion to the cadets at West Point, I can be reminded of the speeches that sent the Athenian army to its destruction in Sicily in 415 BC, and I don't have to wait for dispatches from Afghanistan to suspect that the shooting script for the Pax Americana is a tale told by an idiot. In the news magazines, I read about the unhygienic environments imperiling the health and safety of the American people. Pesticides in the rivers, carcinogens in the soup, cigarette smoke in the park. And somehow I take comfort in the long life and splendor of Louis XIV, who was said to have bathed only once during the years 1647, 1711. Water was under suspicion in 17th century Christian Europe, and except in the baptismal font, bathing was to be avoided because it invited sin. There's a long speech by St. Jerome, who actually says that women should be kept as filthy as possible, thus to, relieve temptation. Confronted with the malfunction of the critics handing out the nation's literary prizes, I grant them the excuse of an historical precedent, bearing in mind President Teddy Roosevelt's opinion of Henry James, a miserable little snob, of Thomas Paine, a filthy little atheist, of Leo Tolstoy, a sexual and moral pervert. On being informed by the propaganda ministries of the Republican right that money is a synonym for peace on earth and goodwill toward men, that the capitalist free market is virtue incarnate, I resist the call for a standing ovation by remembering that Hugo Boss dressed Hitler's troops, that the Ford Motor Company in the 1930s outfitted the Wehrmacht with its armored trucks, that the Rockefeller Foundation financed the pre-war medical research meant to confirm Nazi theories of racial degeneration. The common store of our shared history is what Goethe had in mind when he said that the inability to draw on 3,000 years is living hand to mouth. It isn't with symbolic icons that men make their immortality. They do so with what they've learned on their travels across the frontiers of the millennia, salvaging from the wreck of time what they find to be useful or beautiful or true. And what preserves the voices of the great authors from one century to the next is not the recording device, the clay tablet, the scroll, the codex, the book, the computer, the iPad, but the force of imagination and the power of expression. It is the strength of the words themselves, not their product placement, that invites the play of mind and induces a change of heart. This, of course, is the point of Orwell's wonderful essay on the politics of the English language. That if you don't know how to use words, if you don't think very well, and that leads to bad politics. For example, the war on terror is a war on an unknown enemy and an abstract noun, and it can't be won. It's a meaningless phrase, and that was Orwell's point. And my and writing to me is learning. At least for me, learning to think. As I say, I never know what I think until I try to put it down on paper. This is also the same point was made by Francis Bacon when he's talking about the writing of the essay. So I'm open to all. Again, what is meant, I've often heard it said that the truth shall make us free, right? But what is meant by the truth as a synonym for liberty doesn't emerge from a collection of facts or an assimilation of doctrine, nor does it come with a declaration of war or the blessing of Christ. It's synonymous with the courage that individuals derive from not running a con game on the unique character and specific temper of their own minds, finding a story that settles the wilderness of their experience with the fence posts of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And to me, that's the adventure. Writing, I think of it as an adventure, and it can take a long time, and I throw away a lot of pieces of paper, and probably spend too much time with it. As the editor of the magazine over the years, I've met some writers who can do it very, very easily. I mean, extremely fluent in the way that Twain was, and can do it with, on the first or second draft. John Updike could do it that way, but most don't. At least it's been my experience. Certainly, that's my own experience, and but it's I find it exciting, and I'm like Casals. I'm always hoping to learn something. Those are my preliminary remarks, but I hope to make. Please ask any question you want. Drove me nuts. I tell you what the hardest thing to do was to commission somebody to write something. You'd have an idea, would usually follow from a conversation, and why don't you go and do this? And then the guy would turn in or the woman would turn in the manuscript, and it wasn't any good. And that was the hard part, to tell them. Sometimes you could tell them how to rewrite it, and it could be saved. But sometimes you'd invested their best hopes, and they're talented people, and for whatever reason it didn't come off. But it was always worth taking the chance. I like to take chances with writers who weren't established and didn't know, and that was the best part of the job, was being the number of over the years of young people who published their first piece or their first story in Harper's magazine. Many of them went on to be quite famous. Well, this is part. I grew up in with books, so I happen to like books. I like the way they feel. I like the turning of the pages and so forth. And I don't read this on the screen in the same way. I don't find it. I don't yet have a Kindle, so I may be completely wrong about that. But I do know that you somehow, when you're writing let's see, when you're trying to get attention on the internet, you're writing for an algorithm. You're writing for a thing that will seize a couple of key words, and so you're writing for a machine. And the beautiful thing about a writer like, let's say, Twain, is that it's clear that he has such a magnificent sense of timing, and that's why he was a lecturer and would come on stage. He could entertain people. So, and it's for the ear, and that's how he gets. He has a wonderful sense of cadence and rhythm. But again, when you're writing for television, even when you're writing, let's say, his emphasis is on words, and he's writing for people. He has, in a room like this, he has a reader in mind. and when you're writing for, let's say, television, you're writing again for a machine because you're writing for either a laugh track or in a very limited space of time. I once had to write I wrote a documentary television documentary for British independent television on American foreign policy in the 20th century. It was a 6-part series, which you would think 6 hours, you would think that would be a lot of time. American foreign policy in the 20th century, but it came down to I was also writing. I was doing the stand up to the camera, but I was also writing the voiceovers. So I got to the point where I had 78 seconds and 43 words, or maybe it was 43 seconds and 78 words, I can't remember. But it was to explain the origins of World War II. And and not only that, but the voiceover had to connect the still photography of the Munich conference in fall of 1938 with movie footage of the German Stukas bombing Warsaw in September of 1939. And that's when I really understood that the McLuhan's notion that the medium is the message. And we shape our tools, and our tools then shape us. And I think that to write for the, at least directly for the internet, it's a different instrument. I mean, when the vocabulary that we've lost in 1940, the average high school senior in America had something like a vocabulary of 12,000 words, and today it's like 5. So, and that's too bad. And again, I don't know. I don't write a blog because when people tell me it all has to be in the first 2 sentences, and I'm writing for some kind of algorithm that is going to either like it or not. I don't know how to talk to the algorithm. It's a different kind of thing. I mean, I'm sure you can put all the classics up on Google, but it's not so much whether they'll be available or whether they'll still be read, as a question of how will people in the next generation write. But again, there's a historical precedent. When Gutenberg comes up with a movable type in 1450s, outcry from all of the humanists in Europe and in Italy, and people like myself who are saying that this is horrendous, this is awful, I mean, God. But it's another 100 years before you get to Cervantes and Montaigne and Shakespeare, who come along at the end of the next century. So maybe out of the internet, we shape our tools shape us. Maybe there'll be a new language will, or a new politics. No, I try to have an outline, more or less. But usually I do quite a lot of reading before I start writing something, and I organize it in blocks. I kind of think I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to try to get here and here and here, and then I start writing it. But it changes as I start writing it. It gives me a way to get at it. but it often changes. What I thought I was going for, I end up not to, it goes somewhere else. But I try to start with some plan. But I abandon it fairly, you know. Well, I mean, there's Annie Dillard, there's Joan Didion, there's Marilyn Robinson. I mean, the three. Veronica Gang was very good, I thought. I mean, these were four of. Sally Tisdale can be good too. But again, you don't, at least at Harper's, believe it or not, one does not get that many submissions of essays from women. And you can tell me, I don't know why that is, but, and maybe, maybe it will change. But I have the same difficulty, here we get in the whole history of the oppression of women over the entire period of Western civilization. I've just been reading a book about Diderot, who's very articulate on this subject. He's trying to educate his daughter, and to find a decent education for a woman in 18th century France was almost impossible. Rousseau, actually, in his theories of education, says that women should only be taught to sew, and that they should remain weak and submissive. Rousseau's a monster, as far as I can see, but I don't know. I mean, I mean, maybe I could be hanged for saying this, but I mean, maybe women are find it easier in different forms. I mean, maybe fiction. Or the epistolatory novel. Yes.
You've spoken about the relationship between writing and thought, and you made reference to the sound of a writer and of a writer's voice. What exactly do you think is the relationship between thought and speech, and literally the spoken word? And when you write, do you listen to yourself?
Yes, I do. But that's because I'm one of my other early hopes. I abandoned the hope of being, as you know, an historian. But I also had an early hope of becoming a poet. And it's probably a mistake to try to, work some poetic form or imagery or metaphor into prose. At least that's no longer the fashion. People used to write that way. If you go back to the 18th century, if you read again people like Gibbon or Guadella or Lytton Strachey, or the Elizabethans, but the sort of since Ernest Hemingway, that approach to prose is gone out of style. It might come back, and it might come back in a even more compressed form on the internet. I mean, that may that
question again. Don't you think that might be a value for the internet?
It could be.
Electronic communication.
Yeah, I think the internet, the writing for the internet, will probably end up more like poetry than prose. I mean, I think it will go in that direction, because that's the way I would think it would get, because it's about compression. I did learn. I mean, and I had that was my first lesson, but then I was lucky enough, when I was a contributing writer to the Saturday Evening Post, to have as my editor a man named Otto Friedrich. And Otto Friedrich was truly a great editor. I mean, most of everything I know about writing and editing I learned from Friedrich. And I used to, it was my ambition to be able to write a piece for the Saturday Evening Post that would go past Otto without a mark on it, right? That's what I was hoping. It never happened. And the Otto would, mark it up awkward. He would, what does this mean? And he would say, I'd spend weeks, not weeks because I didn't have weeks, but days on the first two lacquered pages. And Otto would simply cut the entire 2 pages and he'd say that, it starts here with the story on page 3, right? And so what I learned from him, I try to teach other writers for Harper's Magazine. And I found out that the better the writer, the more willing they were to take advice, because it was the difference between a good writer and a mediocre writer. The mediocre writer was usually so wrapped up in himself or herself. And the better writer had an idea that was somewhere out there. And if you could help that person get closer to that idea, it had to be the idea that he or she had. I mean, I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth. And I didn't do rewriting. I mean, we talk about it. But I did learn how to do that, and learning how to do that also was helping me, because I'd tell them something and then I'd see that I'd made the same mistake myself. And I had 2 young editors at Harper's Magazine who were not afraid of me, so that they would tell me when I'd give it to them about draft 3. And they were very blunt. And we kind of learned from each other.
And any famous people that you gave comments to and their response to it, that would be fun for us to hear.
I don't know. I can remember picking Annie Dillard out of absolutely nowhere. I mean, it came in from an agent who was not a very big deal agent, and it was one chapter of a book, which eventually became Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And all it said was A. Dillard. I had no idea whether it was a man or a woman. And I called up the agent and I said, ordinarily I would pay $500 for this piece. This is in the early 70s when Harper's was paying that kind of money. But I'm willing to go to $750 if I can have a first option on the book. And the agent said, fine. So that Harper's Magazine very briefly had an allied publishing house. It didn't work out, but we did publish the Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. But I don't remember. I used to make, Christopher Hitchens rewrite. Hitchens is another one of those writers that's very, very fluent and very easy. I mean, he can, dead drunk at 8 o'clock in the morning, he can turn out 3,000 words by noon, right? But it gets better if he'll rewrite it. And so I used to try to talk him into doing that. Sometimes I succeeded. But it's all a negotiation. I mean, you're dealing with and I never tried to. The other thing was that I never tried to, because I could write my own thing every month. I never tried to put words in the mouth of the writer, which is what they do at places like Time Magazine. Well, I have a lot of help. I mean, there are editorial advisors, if you see that on the masthead, which include historians, and some of them are journalists. I mean, there's Eric Foner, there's a guy named Richard Cohen, there's Barbara Ehrenreich. There are about 20 of them. Edward Rootbach, I mean, and John Major. They have different specialties. I mean, there are a couple of people that know a lot about the history of Islam, and there are others that know about China. And we always have trouble, by the way, getting Islamic text and Chinese text. And I'm still trying to work on that. One of the problems with the Islamic text is that it doesn't translate into writing that's fun to read from somebody who's brought up in the Western tradition. But I don't know what to do about that. But I don't know, I have a lot of help. In other words, I mean, these are the kind of people that you have, as at least I had, a number of teachers in my life who would had all of these texts in their heads, and you'd say you want to write something about X, and they'd say, well, you can't possibly do that until you've read A, B, C, you know, and they, so that when we sit down and talk about an issue, they then, sometimes we have meetings, there are about 20 of these people, and sometimes 10 of them show up in New York, and sometimes only 6, but they send suggestions with the email, and then I have I have 3 young, extremely talented editors. They're kids. They're all under 30, and then we read all the texts. And you probably read 400 odd texts in order to get 80, and so again, I would rather work with young, enthusiastic people than some old and jaded pro. And I also, my criterion is simple. It has to be fun to read. So it's not academic, it's not comprehensive, it's not the last word, but these are texts that are fun to read and give some notion of the continuum. See, I mean, I have the notion of history in continuum. I mean, the Huckleberry Finn is still alive because writing is it's a joint venture. I mean, it's the labor of the writer turned to the wheel of the reader's imagination. So that's why Shakespeare still draws a crowd in Central Park. Thank God. Well, again, I mean, we sit around and talk about it. I mean, I have, these visiting scholars or editorial advisors. I mean, they, people like yourself. I mean, and then we just figure out one that might be relevant. So we were very good with one. We did one right at the peak of the healthcare debate. We came out with an issue on medicine, and that was timed well, as was the one on work. So sometimes you get lucky. But I had to do that at Harper's Magazine because Harper's Magazine had a 6-week lead time. So if it was April, you had to figure what was going to be worth reading or more or less topical by July. So I began to learn to think that way. I can tell you the one we're going to do next fall is the future. The history of the future, and that's another thing that's on people's mind. Thank you very much. Okay.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.